Welcome to another video of Tiki's Geckos. This week we're going to talk about some of the most common questions that we get from new keepers, and we're answering your Instagram questions. So one of the most common questions that I get at the reptile shows, in my DMs on Instagram and Snapchat and on Facebook, is a concern that their baby crested gecko isn't eating. Well, guess what? Baby crested geckos are very, very tiny, and reptiles for the most part don't need to eat every single day like mammals do because they have a slower metabolism. That's right, they're cold-blooded, so they have a slower metabolism. Now, a baby crested gecko or gargoyle gecko or leachianis or whatever type of gecko that you have is not going to eat as much as you probably think it is. These guys are very tiny, so think about how small a crested gecko is. Now think about how small the stomach on that crested gecko is. It's not going to eat very much. A gecko might take a couple licks per night, or maybe even eat 2 to 3 times a week and be set for the week. There's no need to stress. A healthy gecko is not going to starve itself. As long as you're feeding the right food and you have the proper enclosure set up, with the right humidity, temperature, the gecko is going to do fine. So a couple things that you could do to assure that your gecko is not going to starve itself is keep it in the appropriate size enclosure. Now, I understand nothing is bigger than the wild. These guys do hatch out in the wild and survive and make it to adulthood. So with that being said, you could technically house them in any size enclosure if you're keeping the enclosure properly. But for beginners, I always recommend something smaller, especially for the babies, because it's going to be easier to monitor the gecko and to keep the right temperature and humidity. If the enclosure is set up correctly, then the gecko will find the food on its own. There is no need to hand feed, and I have raised hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of geckos, and I have never, ever needed to hand feed one of them. So rest assured that if your crested gecko is healthy and you're keeping the right enclosure, the gecko is going to eat on its own. Now, if you're not sure how to keep the right enclosure or how to make sure your crested gecko is healthy, then make sure you check out some of our other videos. Another question that I constantly get is, how long does it take for my crested gecko to go from a baby to an adult? Well, this is a kind of complicated question because there's a lot of factors in play here. The temperature is one, the quality of the food is another one, whether you're housing them by themselves is a big factor as well, and obviously the appetite of your geckos. Some geckos are better eaters than others, and there's really nothing that we could do about that. So, assuming that you're feeding the best diets, which we recommend Repashy or Pangea, and you're feeding insects, probably crickets or roaches, as a staple once a week, and you're consistent, your crested gecko can reach adult size in about 1.5 years. Now, if you're only feeding the diets, which is fine as well, you will get your crested gecko to reach full size in about 3 or 4 years. Now, a big mistake that I see some new keepers make is that they add extra calcium to the diet. Listen, if you don't know what you're doing, it's best if you just leave the diet alone. Most of the diets out there are complete and they have everything that they need to have a well-balanced, levels of calcium to phosphorus and all the vitamins and minerals that they need. So if you throw extra calcium in there, it could actually do more harm than good. Of course, I'm talking about the main diets like the Repashy and some of the Pangea diets that are complete diets. But if you're feeding crickets on the side, you do have to sprinkle the crickets with calcium. Now, one of the more common questions that we get asked all the time is, what size tank should I house my crested gecko in? Assuming that you're starting off with an adult crested gecko, I would recommend a 12 by 12 by 18. This is almost the size of a 10-gallon tank, but put upright. Of course, if you want to house them in something bigger like an 18 by 18 by 18 or an 18 by 18 by 24, you could also do that as long as the humidity and the temperature are kept right. A lot of times in the bigger enclosures, it's going to be a lot harder to keep the right temperatures and the right humidity. Now I want to answer some of your questions that you sent me through Snapchat and Instagram. Keep in mind, guys, I got a lot of questions, but I can't include them all in the video. So we might have to do this again another time or break it up into 2 parts, this video. So the first question comes from Luke Bauman on Snapchat, and he wants to know, how do I know if a crested gecko or a gargoyle gecko is healthy before I buy one? Let's say you're at a reptile show or at Petco or PetSmart and you want to know if this gecko is looking like it's healthy. What are some signs that it is healthy and what are some signs that it's not healthy? Let's go over that. So first thing you should look at are the eyes. If the eyes are kind of sunk in, that is already a bad sign. Usually that means that it is very dehydrated, so you don't want to go with any animal that the eyes are sunk in or that it's moving kind of lethargic. If it's moving lethargic and kind of slow and the tongue flicks are slow, then that gecko has something going on, either dehydration or some sort of parasite or a number of things, but you want to stay away from that gecko. Another thing to take in consideration is looking at, making sure that all the toes and the tail is intact. Obviously, this is not a big deal if the gecko is missing the tail or if it's missing a toe or something. Sometimes this could happen as a baby, and it doesn't mean that the gecko is not healthy. But assuming that you want the perfect gecko, you're getting your pet gecko for your daughter or yourself, you want to make sure that the gecko looks good. So that's something to take in consideration. You always want to look at all the toes, all the the feet, the tail, make sure that there's no infections on the tail. Sometimes baby or juvenile crested geckos that are kept together can bite on each other's tails, and it could cause a little bit of like it could almost get like the tail tip will look like it's rotting, but with time that does heal. And if it is causing a problem, you could put some Neosporin on it, and that's going to help it heal a lot faster. Another thing you should look at, if you get to, is the poop. The poop is important. If you see a solid, firm poop, that's always a good sign. Now, if you see the poop is kind of runny or very like diarrhea-like, it's usually a bad sign, and you want to look at the poop, make sure there's nothing moving in there, because sometimes these animals can carry parasites. Now, I know not all parasites are bad, but you want to make sure that you don't have to deal with any of this stuff, because sometimes it just can add extra stress, extra expenses to you, and you don't want to go through that. Another very good sign is to make sure that the gecko is active. If it just sits there and it's like I said earlier, if it's moving kind of slow and it's not really jumping, then usually that means the gecko is not doing very well. Most geckos will be very jumpy and they will move around a little bit. They might stay still for a couple seconds, but most of the time, I should say, they are going to be jumping or move around. Now, Christian Beck wanted to know, how much food do I go through in a month? So, those big bags from Pangea or Rapashi, I could pretty much go through all that in 1 month. The next question comes from Instagram. iReptiles Breeding is asking, what cage should a gecko be housed in? A screen cage or a glass cage? That's a good question. I always recommend a glass cage because it can hold the humidity a lot better than a screen cage can. But if you know how to take care of these animals, and if you're willing to spray a little bit more, you can house them in a screen cage. I have done that myself in the past, but I find that it's a little bit more maintenance, versus a glass cage or a plastic container where the humidity is going to hold a lot better. It's going to be better for their skin and their shedding, and it's also going to keep them more hydrated. Now, this question also comes from Instagram. It's from Cali Patriot, and he wanted to know how to get baby geckos to eat on their own. We kind of answered this in the beginning, but I will go through it again. If you hatch, let's say you hatch or you buy a baby crested gecko, there's nothing that you have to do to get them to eat on their own. If it's healthy, it would already eat on its own. What I do recommend, however, is to house the gecko in a small enclosure, maybe like a shoebox size 6-quart sterilite enclosure with the proper ventilation, or like a small critter keeper, or like a 5-gallon tank, or the Nano, Exoterra, or Zoomed Cube enclosures. Those are all very Those are all very good for these baby crested geckos. And if you're keeping the right humidity, and you could give them just like a little water bottle cap of food. You could put it in the floor, or you could hang it with a ledge. Your gecko is gonna eat on its own. No need to stress about that, guys. My Gecko Life from Instagram wanted to know what sources of information do I recommend for to go beyond basic care. Well, something I really think you guys should do is every now and then just go take your animal to the vet. Maybe if it's just a checkup, and have a list of questions that you want to ask the vet and pick their brain. I do that all the time. I find it very helpful. But another couple websites that I do recommend to check out if you want to get more in depth when it comes to the information about these animals. The Pangea forums are very good. There's a lot of information on there that you could go check out. And I will put the link below of some other websites that I find very useful. Another really good source of information are the Rapace and Philippe de Vosjoli books, like the Life of Giant Geckos, the Gargoyle Gecko book, the Rack Bible, even though it is a little outdated. But all those books have a ton of good information, and if you could find one, I definitely recommend picking one up. Taylor from Snapchat is asking, why does my crested gecko have no grip when gripping on the glass or any wood or branches in his terrarium? This could be from a number of things. 1, stuck shed. 2, stuck dried food. Crested gecko diet, sometimes they step on it and it dries up and it gets in between the lamellae in their fingers, causing them not to have any stickiness basically. And 3, the substrate. The substrate, if you have the eco earth or some of that more loose substrate, it can get in between the fingers and not cause them to have a good, basically they won't be able to stick on the glass or in the enclosure. What you could do is add some sphagnum moss to the top of that peat moss or that coconut husk, and that's usually gonna not let the geckos get that in their fingers. If the gecko has crested gecko diet or stuck shed, you could try using the sauna method. Basically, you want to put the gecko in a deli cup or a little enclosure and mist them down with some paper towels. That way the skin or the old Rapace diet that's on their fingers could get loose, and then you could try taking it off with a Q-tip or tweezers. Now, Johnny Rax from Instagram made a very good point. Some people think that crested geckos need to be kept wet because we always say, mist once a day or keep the higher humidity levels. But in reality, you do not want to keep these guys wet. You want to increase the humidity, but not necessarily keep it wet like a frog or any amphibian. You want to make sure that the humidity is around 60 to 80% is good. And you're going to reach this humidity level by having the proper enclosure, by misting maybe once a day or maybe once every 2 days, and by having a water bowl if you want to provide that. I see a lot of new people want to get into crested geckos, so they get a whole bunch of bins and they spray the crap out of these bins, and before they know it, they're 100% humidity all the time, and the geckos end up developing a respiratory infection or some bacterial infections. So you got to make sure that the enclosure is not wet. That is very important. Pro Havoc from Instagram wants to know how I got into breeding geckos and when am I going to do a reptile room video. So I got into breeding geckos maybe like, I want to say maybe like 10 years ago, and I've always had a big passion for reptiles, dinosaurs, animals in general. So when I found out that you could actually keep these guys and breed them, it was a no-brainer. Come on. The reptile room video is coming. We're in the process right now of moving to a new facility. So as soon as we move to the facility, that's the first video we're gonna make. Now, Leighton Wag from Snapchat wanted me to explain how to gauge the right temperature in your tank and the humidity. So this is called a temp gun. This is 10 times better than the little dial that you have on your cage right now. With this, you could point at the spot that you wanna measure the temperature at, you click on it, and it's gonna tell you right away 75 degrees, 0.7. It's that specific. So this is the best thing to have, especially if you keep other reptiles, like animals that require a basking spot, maybe like a bearded dragon or some sort of monitor lizard. This is great because you could literally point at the hot side, see what the basking spot is, and then point at the cool side and see how much that is. And you're gonna have the exact temperature, and you're gonna be able to monitor your lizard or your reptile a lot better. This is what I use to gauge the humidity, and I just kind of keep this in my room because I have the gecko room, but you could buy one of these and hook it up to like a probe and put it in your cage. But this will tell you the exact humidity and temperature that is in the room, or if you set it up to the gauge in your cage. So right now I just got it out of the gecko room. It's about 62% humidity in there, and this is what I find is the most accurate. So this is called, that's funny, that's called an accurate humidity monitor, I guess. I actually don't know where I got this from, but I will try to find it and put it in the link below. Now, Carly from Snapchat wanted me to show off some of the Cuban false chameleons and do a care video on them, and we will do that pretty soon, but here's a video of what they look like. Alright guys, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. It helps out the YouTube channel. And subscribe if you like the videos and you want to learn more about different types of reptiles. As always, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, and Twitter to keep up with our life and our animals. And next time I will be answering the YouTube questions, so do me a favor and comment below what you want answered on the next video next week, and I promise I will answer your question. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Gauge the temperature in your tank or the humidity. The humidity? Now, Leighton Wag from Snapchat. I hope the sound is better, by the way. Wasn't working out too. A lot of people were complaining about the sound before, so. Wakanda. Subscribe on YouTube for more videos.